So for tonight, the message that I was given, I've been carrying this one since for about a week, in a way. But one of the things that God had been talking to me about was about discipline. And talking about discipline is always kind of a complicated thing because we tend to conflate scriptures about discipline. So one of the big things with it is there's two types of discipline talked about, and this feels like silly to have to point out. But there's the discipline that's referenced in terms of like disciplining the body, preparing oneself to grow and to develop, versus the discipline that's referred to in terms of like disciplinary action, which is oftentimes looked at as punishment. And the problem is that thanks to the way that the scriptures are lined up and a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament, we oftentimes conflate the two as being the same. And this ends up being very problematic to a lot of us because it can create a very harsh dynamic. Because discipline in and of itself, the concept of disciplining one's body or being disciplined by God, being put in situations where you're going to grow, and it might be very, very hard, it can feel very painful. It can feel very uncomfortable. What is it? Hebrews. There you are. In Hebrews 12, Hebrews 12:11, it says, "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it." And this is kind of the thing that we want to focus on here. Like, we're not talking about the disciplinary action of like punishment or something like that. We're more focused on the concept of disciplining oneself. It almost seems fitting that we were talking about martial arts earlier.
Like the spiritual disciplines, like, is that what you mean?
Like the
like prayer is a spiritual discipline, or like reading the word, or
those tie in. Like, we're a little bit more broad than that.
Okay.
Because the thing about it is that discipline goes a lot further than just like disciplining oneself to pray at a certain amount or doing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are circumstances where the Holy Spirit will, like for example, when Jesus was led out into the desert, when Paul was led out into the desert,
mm-hmm.
These were periods of time. Desert seasons are disciplinary times. And that means that, like, meaning, to explain that, it's a period of time where people are taken out into these very harsh, difficult places and periods of time, these seasons that are dedicated to helping them develop in their relationship with God. Because one of the complicated and difficult things for us, especially coming off of the back of the message, is about sovereignty and about the way that our perception can cloud our ability to receive who God is, to even see or understand Him. The way that concepts of His that are so invaluable, like love, peace, for example, each of these things can become totally entwined and twisted by our earthly understanding of what these things look like and what they mean, so that they become the kinds of things where when God talks about love, we perceive it in such a way as we're comfortable with or as we prefer to see it. And as a result, we completely lose track of who God is. And He becomes, the kind of person who would rather punish somebody with cancer or death than patiently wait for them to understand something that He's trying to teach them. In the same kind of vein, discipline can fall into the same kind of thing, because we have to kind of, or rather we have to kind of like learn through those things. That's kind of the methodology by which he shifts that perspective, that paradigm. As we come to him and we learn from him, we go through seasons of famine and learn that we can trust him to provide. It's so that when Jesus talks about in Matthew, when he references not worrying over the things that the pagans worry over, like what we will eat, what clothes we'll wear, it's that process of learning that yes, we can trust God for those things, actually trust him, not just assume he's going to provide for us, but rather to trust and have faith in him to provide for us. It's a difficult thing because our earthly minds, and because the reality is that a lot of Christians, in truth, they live a lifestyle separate from relationship with God, but rather one focused on following and practicing Christianity, but they don't live it. It's the same kind of thing that where one forces their own body, where one disciplines themselves on their own groundings, their own teachings, and pushes themselves to live a certain way, to act a certain way, to develop a rhythm or a pattern that is outside their norm. It's actually funny because, like, when we were talking about martial arts, for example, one of the things that was alluring about Krav Maga, when Jeremy and I were talking about it, is that the explanation on Krav Maga was that it focuses on things that come more naturally to the person. Exactly. It's relying on the individual's instincts and what they can do through that, as opposed to, say, Taekwondo or karate, like traditional karate, where there is so much that you have to force yourself to learn that can be so far outside of what's actually like natural for you. I mean, even just, I remember distinctly like having to learn how to punch in karate, and it's this full on like you have to like adjust your entire stance and like do these motions of like twisting your body in such a way, and they explain the mechanics of it, and it's like, that's fine, but this is incredibly cumbersome if I ever get into an actual fight. If somebody comes at me swinging or trying to tackle me and I have to like
You go, hoi, hoi, hoi.
exactly, and like it doesn't really work as well in practice, which was something that one of my favorite stories from martial arts was actually one that Jeremy had to go through, and I don't think he would mind having this story told. But it was in Kempo training, and there was this old move in Kempo called a dragon kick, and it's literally like basically what you do is you do like a standing cartwheel, like a one-handed cartwheel where you move your legs around towards the other person and you hit them with it, right?
Roundhouse.
Oh no, you're full-on cartwheel.
Oh.
Like that's what it looks like.
That must be an old style too.
It is an old style.
And
Old
it might
style
be
martial arts.
Japanese because I did Chinese, I think.
It's Kempo.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it's from that particular like fighting style, and Jeremy asked his master about this and was just like, you know, what about these kinds of things? And the guy's like, sure, yeah. He's like, I try to take a more his master tried to take a more like pragmatic approach to Kempo. So he would focus more on what was actually useful in an actual fight. And he was explaining that to everybody. And he was like, here, Jeremy, throw a dragon kick at me. And Jeremy's like, okay. So he goes to do it. And the dude just, like, kicks him. As he's, like, mid-motion on one hand, flipping towards him. He just kicked him off of his hand. And Jeremy just collapses. And he's just like, yeah. So that's not a practical thing to do in an actual fight.
Yeah.
And this is why.
In Krav Maga, we don't kick above waist level because once you you start high kicking, all they have to do is grab your leg and you're in big trouble.
Yep. When I was in judo, one of the big moves that we were taught was the high grab. If anybody tries to catch you, it's literally just this quick motion. And if you catch their leg, or when you catch their leg, you have complete control over them.
Yeah.
Oh, you go to the ground then, and that's like the hardest, most exhausting place to have to fight.
Exactly. We did it in training, and like they had me in like a sparring match. They had me catch the guy. One guy tried to high kick me, and I caught his leg, and just threw him to the ground and slapped him in an ankle lock and made him and tapped him. And like it was one of those things. They were just like, yeah, that's why you don't kick high. But anyway, with all of that said, there's kind of this point of like, with those particular like old style moves like that dragon kick, or you know, a lot of those things, you're basically taking and pushing yourself way outside of your comfort zone, way outside of what's natural, way outside of you yourself, and you're forcing yourself to match somebody else's idea of what something is. And as a result, you can be really bad at it. And even if you're really good, you might still not match up to somebody who's trained more in such a way.
Or who it comes more naturally to.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can spend all your time, all your effort working and working and working at this thing, and you will never be as good as somebody who it comes more naturally to, or to somebody who trains in a style that is more their own.
Yeah.
That's why, like, Krav Maga was considered one of the better styles of martial arts, because
Tailored to the person.
it's tailored to the person as opposed to the person tailoring themselves to match it,
Oh.
because that works better.
Mm-hmm.
If you're somebody who the point is made. I don't have to continue with this, but in that same vein, many Christians take the same kind of approach to their faith. And the thing about it is that, like, for those who know God very, very well, there are parts of it where you do have to come outside of yourself. But the shocking thing for most of us ends up being, like, you know, how the relationship is unique with each person.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that we ran into, like Heather and I getting married, is like the way that God spoke to us, and how very, very different it was. Like with God, like anytime that God gave me a word for her, it felt to me very soft in a way. Like he was very, very, very gentle with her.
Yeah, he always is.
In a way that I was not familiar with.
And when I got words for him, they seemed incredibly harsh. I was like, you want me to say what?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But they were just more direct and more...
Very blunt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is how, you know, in all of my time with God, that's how I always preferred him to talk to me. It was
Yeah.
always just like, from the beginning, it was all, when he started like talking to me, it was always like, okay, just tell me the truth, even if I'm not ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you tell me the truth, I might struggle with it, but I'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how life went for the longest time. So when Heather and I got married and she started giving me words and whatnot, she was always just like, okay, you might be really mad about this, and I don't know, I'm not comfortable saying it, but this is what he told me to say. And I'm just like, that sounds right. Yeah. Or, I'm really mad about this, but I know you're right.
Yes, which
So-
I'm more used to now.
I'm just gonna, don't worry, I'm just gonna take this, I'm gonna grumble about it for a while, and then after it's had time, I'll get there.
Yeah. Yep. There's a process.
Yeah. But that's the thing, is that, like, so many relationships are tailored, like God meets us where we're at in relationship. You know, like so many of us, we think that disciplining ourselves in this way will carry us to the top of the mountain where we can meet God. And for so many Christians, that's the mentality, is we're climbing the mountain to reach Jesus. But the one thing with God that's really important for us to understand is that he doesn't intend for us to meet him at the top of the mountain. He wants to climb the mountain with us.
Mm-hmm.
And see, this is where discipline can become, where discipline is something that we have to stop and look at. Because we have to re-envision what discipline looks like. Because for a lot of us, it's super easy, especially with the more strict our backgrounds were, or the more harsh things have been for us. It's really easy to get into this cold calculus of how we should live and how we should be. And believing in Jesus doesn't change that mentality. In fact, there are many verses, like we can pull up a dozen verses from the Old Testament that people use as like a justification for some of the most harsh treatments and harsh behaviors. Oh. Deuteronomy 8:5. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Deuteronomy 11:2. Remember today that your children were not the ones who saw and experienced the discipline of the Lord your God, his majesty, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Like, we have a lot of different scriptures. The page on discipline that I only have a couple verses screenshotted from, because it was just this to make an example. We grab onto those and we use them as like a justification to basically torture ourselves. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. Like, there is a time and a place for discipline where we will go through hard things. It's the difference between when I was in the basic training, for example, and the drill sergeants would have us run and work at and do push-ups and sit-ups and all kinds of different calisthenic exercises in order to discipline us in terms of punishment. If somebody messed up, they would wear us down. But there was one point where we were getting ready for a like an 18K march or something like that. I can't remember what exactly it was anymore. But I remember the drill sergeant distinctly stopping us because everyone was like tired and sore and wondering why he was torturing us, and he just stopped us and he was like, guys, this is not punishment, okay? He's like, I am disciplining you. And what I mean by that is I don't mean punishment. I mean that you need to get into better shape so you can accomplish this goal. And that was the point. After that changed the whole mentality of everybody there. Everyone.
So it was suddenly a building up instead of a tearing down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that's important for us, is to be able to recognize this as a concept. Because when God took people out into the desert, when he led people out to these hard places, when he took people through these hard times, when he said, Hosea, marry this prostitute, there were things attached to those that were discipline. And it was for the purpose of developing something, of making a point. Even Hosea. And a lot of us, like, we know the story of Hosea for him being called to marry this prostitute and have kids with her. And it was meant to be an illustration to the people of Israel about what the relationship between God and Israel looked like. But you ever consider the fact that Hosea loved that woman? Like, Hosea loved Nimrod.
Her name was Nimrod?
If I recall correctly,
I
yes.
think it's a little bit different. I'm gonna look it up.
ahead. Look it up.
Nimrod is what I used to call my little brother when he was annoying.
I forget if that is their name. That was also the name of someone else in the Bible.
If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It's I'm grabbing at old
It
knowledge.
just sound like something bad.
Of course, it sounds like something bad.
Well, the other guy was a bad dude, for sure.
Yeah.
He was went by that name.
Yeah.
So that Looney Tunes also.
Anyway, but the thing with it was that like Hosea loved this woman, and the illustration here it was an exercise in discipline in terms of being able to grow and learn the character of God in this relationship that God was already existing in with Israel. It was an opportunity to develop that, to house that, to be that. And this is something that we oftentimes struggle with. Like, it goes back to the old statement, like, some people will tell you don't pray for patience because God will put you in situations where you will have to learn patience. And, it's not really, that's not a good outlook on it. Like, you should want patience. It's just, it is trying, but that's the point. Is through that process, through that period with all those annoying customers or friends or family or whoever it is that shows up and tests you, it's meant to bore and to create something out of your heart, to provide you the opportunity to learn this and to grow in it. But one of the things about discipline is that the difference between a building up exercise and a tearing down exercise is how far we take it. Because by that same token, by that same statement about discipline, you get things like flatulence, flagellation.
Maybe that's the second time you've done that.
I'm batting 1,000 tonight, guys.
At least this time he figured it out.
Flagellation.
Yo,
The flatulations flagellating other people.
Good one.
Sometimes. Anyway. It's-
Flatulation.
It is the plural form of sharing flatulence. But
Oh dear.
but the old Catholic practice of flagellation was like they took verses from Paul where he said, discipline, where he talked about disciplining your body and bringing your body under control. No.
Her name is Gomer.
I knew it.
All right.
So, no more Nimrod.
I was wrong then. This happens.
You can call my little brother Nimrod, but not her.
You should look up Nimrod.
You're not Gomer Pyle though. That's
Right. So I remembered it was like a weird,
Gomer.
not so good to remember name,
Think of Homer.
like Nimrod,
But Gomer.
Oh, batting 1,000 tonight. Anyways, so with the whole thing with flagellation was about how like they took this quote from Paul where he talked about bringing your body or disciplining your body, and they twisted it, and it became a thing where their interpretation of disciplining their body was literally whipping themselves and hurting themselves. They moved from a state of trying to develop a self-building exercise to something that would tear themselves down because they were trying to force themselves to develop in such a way.
They were being their own teacher.
They were being their own teacher in the most horrendous of ways.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Like,
because the Holy Spirit was not leading that.
Right. And that's kind of that's the thing. That's the thing where it's important for us to remember that discipline is something that's going to be led by the Holy Spirit. There are things that we do, of course, that are going to be, valid and helpful and aid us in growing and developing righteously. But we have to also temper that with mercy and rest. See, by the same token, when you talk about how, like a lot of us, we need to remember the fact that when we talk about God and how he values discipline, he also loves mercy. And there's a place for us where we can if we are disciplining ourselves, we can push ourselves way too far and way too hard. We'll burn ourselves out. We'll run ourselves ragged. We will hurt ourselves in the most literal sense of the word.
And learn the wrong things.
And learn the wrong things from it, yeah. But in the end, like, the biggest thing that we will fail to see is who God is in this particular situation in this way. It's how we develop the idea that God demands so much sacrifice that he starts to become merciless and demanding. But God is the one who also called us to love mercy, who describes himself as merciful. That's not just something he says, it's something that he is. One of the verses I was given to read is in Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
What was it again, Micah? What?
6:8. Micah, speaking as a prophet, is sharing this point, but it's this key thing of just like, what has God called you to do? And in this vein, like, walking humbly with the Lord is extremely important because it counters the point of discipline that can lead us into pride, which is so easy. I remember as a younger Christian myself, and like, I had this whole like mentality of like I used to refer to myself that I wanted to be a man of the law. And I learned that was very foolhardy. And I've actually run into people since then who have wanted to style themselves in that same particular way. They would call themselves a man of the law. And it's just like, that's not what Jesus died for you to have, first off. And second off, that's not what God's calling you into. Like, that's too hard. And the only thing that makes us say, well, I really want to do it, is pride. That's literally it. The same ambitiousness that pushes us to want to attain a goal that's outside of our purview, and specifically outside of what we're asked for or asked to do, it oftentimes becomes the kind of thing where it's fed by that innate pride that wants to be the one to pull it off or wants to be the one to do it. So a lot of followers of Jesus, they fall into this, and it can skew their relationship with God. It can set you back years as you fall into a harsher and harsher reality of what you're of do's and don'ts. And it can actually create separation as you start to judge yourself harshly based off of your performance. It basically becomes the kind of thing where you create your own prison in relation to God. You incidentally turn him into the harsh master that Jesus describes in parables, as opposed to his Father, who he talks to, who he follows, whose will he does. And it's really easy to do, because that little inkling of pride can really so easily just shift us and tilt us into that place where discipline becomes something that we're proud of. It becomes something that we take greater pleasure in than our actual relationship with God, because it's our accomplishment. In Micah, when he says to walk with God, like walk humbly with your Lord, that's kind of the thing that's pulled up for us to kind of look at. What does it mean to walk humbly with the Lord? What does it mean to love mercy? See, one of the things that's really big for us as in modern day, as Christians, but just as people, is the appreciation of mercy. Because we don't really. Like, especially with the kind of like harsher backgrounds that some of us have. I know when I was younger, I certainly did not appreciate mercy. I thought it was weak. Like, growing up with the past that I did, I learned that if somebody challenges you, then the thing that you should do, the appropriate response, is to crush them. And to make them so afraid of you that they would never challenge you again. And this was a mentality that I developed throughout all the fighting and just assorted situations that I was put in as a kid, that fear was power and mercy was for the weak. So when I started pushing further into relationship with God, I remember going to church at one point, and we did one of those really bad, like, spiritual gifts tests that they do for youth groups. And my little brother got mercy as one of his gifts.
Oh, it's
No, it was Matt.
oh, what?
No, that's why I say they're bad tests. Anyway, but he got that, and I remember just like looking at when he said it, I was just kind of like, what a scrub, he's got mercy. And then I stopped and thought about it. I was like, wait. If I remember, I seem to recall Jesus really liking mercy. I feel like I'm supposed to like this too. That's going to need to change. Because we live in a world that, our culture is the kind where, if you remember, like, when we talked about narcissism months and months and months ago, it's last year, I think, even, but we did the message specifically talking about narcissism, and there was that Dr. Rami, I believe her name was, where she had specified the point that, like, she could describe a narcissist to you as being a clinical problem, but if you open up a book that's like a guide to business management, all of those that was the list of things that you should be in order to achieve great things in business. Like,
Yeah.
this is the kind of, like, culture that we live in.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
with that being the reality,
Just a little bit.
You feel my eyes burn a little?
It's making your eyes burn too?
A little bit.
Yeah, sometimes it gets heavy.
the reality of it, though, is that with that particular kind of concept in mind, you can see where mercy kind of falls through the cracks in terms of values. So when we come to Christ and we're talking, and he's talking about God's telling his people to love mercy over and over and over again. Like, it's in Isaiah, it's like chapter 1 of Isaiah. There it is. I don't know what translation this is, but it doesn't say it. But yeah,
Love mercy.
yeah. It says, cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow. So, but on many occasions, God will talk about loving mercy. Jesus will talk about showing mercy. And the thing for us is to also kind of, well, not kind of, align our hearts with that mentality, that heart that values mercy as a concept, as a part of life.
Yes. And a part of God.
And part of God, yeah. Because the thing about it is that discipline, for all the good things that can come out of it, like, it can build you up and make you into such a strong person. Imagine having the kind of faith that's been disciplined by fire. You know, you're able to, you're just kind of like that Paul, or that Peter, that John the Baptist. John the Baptist was running around in the desert, eating locusts and wearing camel furs, and he had no problems with the fact that he was just following God the whole way. He just wandered.
And looked nothing like a Pharisee.
Looked nothing like a Pharisee. Looked nothing like a legitimate holy man. He looked like just a crazy wild creature that lived out in the wilderness. But people came to him to be baptized, because he had the presence of God with him.
Yes.
And this is the thing, is that he probably went through so many trials, so many things that God led him through, and he just drew closer and closer and closer. Elijah, Elisha, Ezekiel, these people all went through these trials with God. Daniel. I mean, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were literally in a fire and came out of it unscathed. But so many of these people, they just learned to be able to follow God. And one of the things is that, like, in training with prophets in the past, like, I remember, like, talking to people and even, like, doing trainings myself, where it was like talking about how part of it is the process. You glean the discipline of obeying God when he tells you to something. He gives you a message and says, go share it, and you go share it. And it can be difficult because it might be a hard word. It might be scary to even just approach somebody and be like, hey, this is what I'm hearing. Is this real? And then seeing what happens. And that's how so many have to, like, learn, because it's an experiential thing. But it requires the discipline of, like, overcoming your own fear, your own discomfort, and walking over to this person and having that confrontation, which half the time doesn't even end up being a confrontation. If you've got a legitimate word from God, what you're going to end up doing is finding that he's already made the way.
He's already been preparing our heart. Yeah.
All you did was, he's got the lock in his hands, and he just gave you the key. But that's one of those things where it requires a discipline. But through that process, that's something that can really develop us, really build us up, really make us strong, faithful believers. The kinds of, like, people who change atmospheres and shake the very foundations of culture and worlds. But it all has to be tempered by mercy. Because we can push ourselves to extremes, but we can also project those extremes on other people. See, the Pharisees also valued discipline very, very much. It was key, it was fundamental to their walk with God, as it were. The phylacteries that they wore on their heads, for example, were scriptures that they had memorized. There were so many different things that they did and said and pursued, and it was all raw discipline, but it was not tempered by mercy. It was born, and as a result, it bore pride in them. They weren't doing it with God, they were doing it for God. But in reality, it was for themselves. So there's a place for us to grow and to get stronger and develop and to have God lead us through the hardest parts and harshest things in life, to be able to survive them and come out the other side and be able to say, yeah, when somebody else comes up to you and says, well, I'm going through this hard time, it's like, yeah, God's got you. Because the reality is that you now have that experience. And the thing about it is there's a major difference in when you share a testimony. There's a major difference in sharing a testimony based on belief versus a testimony based on experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a matter anymore of, I think this is how it is. I believe this is how it is. It's a matter of, this is how it is. This is who God is. This is who he actually is in this situation. There's no more guesswork. There's no more assumption. It's raw. It's real. And it's something that other people can sink their teeth into and to grow from. Because it will sustain them or help sustain them through the very hard times that they will suffer. Because there is nothing new under the sun. The lives that we most of us lead have already been led by others in some fashion. And there will be many more who follow, who go through hard experiences that they will share with us. And we will be the salt and light to them, because we will have experienced these things, and we will have walked through it with God. And as followers of Jesus who are now strengthened by the discipline that this inspired, that we can now say, this is who God is, because I know him, I've met him, I've felt him through this, I've survived this, I've been here, and now I understand and live this. That temperament can change the lives of others who need it. But in all of it, in the places where we seek discipline, we need to temper it with mercy, because God always will. God will push us past what's comfortable, like contrary to what some will tell you. He will definitely put you in situations where it's awful. But he'll also provide you the out and provide you the way through it. Because his intentions are good for us. His will is for us to know him and be close to him and know that we're loved by him. Because in the end, he does not substitute discipline for relationship. Relationship matters most to him. And this is something for us to take stock in, to remember as we carry on through life and whatever trials we end up facing. Because through those trials we will be strengthened. It will be uncomfortable, it will be painful, but you'll be okay. And what's more than that is, if you follow God through it, you'll come out the other side more knowledgeable, more understanding, and stronger.
discipline led by the Holy Spirit has to bear good fruit. Like, it's the nature of the Holy Spirit. We can't not bear good fruit.
Yeah.
But if we walk through a discipline process, like, on our own, or just kind of like basing it on our own knowledge, we don't know how to discipline ourselves in love. Where do we get off thinking we do? Like, we need the Holy Spirit. We need Jesus to love us.
Yeah.
Love us through.
Yeah.
And He can bestow perfect love on us. He can bring us through discipline that bears a good fruit. This is part of building our house on the rock. That scripture that's been in my head a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm at the point where that's all I've got here, so I
Okay.
was just,
I'm waiting for you to say that.
oh, okay.
That's all I've got.
I was just
That's,
letting you share.
let's say stay classy.
That's what you're